Hi, everybody. Welcome to week three. And you can see the title of my slide there, which is HRM, is Human Resource Management really strategic? I mean, I that's the title of our book, right? Strategic Human Resources Management, or that's the author's theme. That's what she stresses, that human resources management should be a strategic endeavor in the organization. And so I'm asking this question really based on what she writes in chapter two. I'm going to have some more to say about that in a little bit. First thing I want to say, though, is that I have a reminder for you, and that is that the proposal for your issues paper, your term paper, is due during week four. So not this week, week three, but on September 15th, week four, on Saturday. I will be asking for your proposal for you to post on Canvas. Again, I want to remind you that if you have concerns or questions, or you just want to really discuss it with me on the phone, or you want to meet on campus at a mutually agreeable time, please do let me know. I am more than happy to do any of those things because I want everyone in class to succeed. That is my overriding philosophy of graduate school. I really want everyone to succeed. So let me move right into this week's lecture. So, um, what I'd like to share with you is that when I bought this book and I was looking through the chapters, I had I had some problems with this chapter because it didn't jump out at me that much, and I don't know if that was your impression. It's not really that much of a criticism because I can see where the author's coming from, but I thought at my first reading it seemed a little bit disjointed. It seemed like she was jumping from topic to topic, and I wasn't seeing the unifying theme. And after I read it some more, I came to a conclusion that really what the author is talking about is really this word strategy and the strategic importance of HRM. So a few lead-in points on that. First of all, what the author contends throughout the book, really, and a lot of other scholars contend, is that with mixed degrees of success, the function of HR, or sometimes what we might call the department of HR in an organization, has moved beyond its role as something of a compliance monitor to really a strategic partner within management. So really, the the idea is that strategic human resources management is part of the management team. It's not it's a technical advisor in some respects, but really it's part of the management team. The second point is that HR senior leaders have to possess competencies that are not unlike those of other senior leaders in the organization, and the chapter lists about 18 of those in part of the chapter, uh, competencies that would be desirable for senior leaders in human resources management. The third point is that your human resources function, if you will, has to be a part of any strategic planning process in order to ensure the right mix of employees is available at a minimum. So, at a minimum, um, any strategy or strategic plan that an organization has promulgated really includes the human beings that are part of human resources, right? So, at a minimum, HR has to be linked at that point. And then HR information systems. So there's a whole about 6 pages of the chapter that talks to HR information systems. They have to become, or they have become more useful with the addition of functionalities, but they have to continue to develop. So what I mean by that is that, it's very common now for HR information systems to include a full suite of actions and like training, payroll, a lot of things that are off-the-shelf platforms that a lot of organizations use, and some organizations even contract out this kind of a function to other organizations, but they have grown. And then finally, this assertion that HR itself as an organizational function has to have a strategic function. But the overriding question that I think this chapter asks really is strategic HRM truly strategic? And I have an approach to this, and it's really going to supplement your reading of the chapter. It's not going to review the chapter. It's going to supplement your reading of the chapter, and I hope you appreciate the approach I'm using. So in the chapter, Pines suggests this workforce planning model, which she cites from the Office of Personnel Management, the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, which has been around since 1978, and the Civil Service Reform Act. So Office of Personnel Management says that when you're doing workforce planning, you have this 5-step approach. First, you develop a strategic direction. So you link workforce planning with an agency plan. Second, you analyze the workforce. That's the workforce that exists. You identify skill gaps and conduct a workforce analysis. Third, you develop an action plan, which is simply you're identifying strategies to close those gaps that you identified in the analysis. Fourth, you implement this action plan, and that means that you're actually putting these human and fiscal resources in place to implement the plan. And then finally, you monitor, evaluate, and revise. So monitoring progress and adjusting as you go along is actually very important in any planning process, and HR planning is not the least of these. Okay, so here's the point where I really want to supplement the chapter. I'm going to do that by referring to John Bryson. So I have taught strategic planning, and some of you have taken a strategic planning class. And if you took a strategic planning class, I'm fairly confident you probably used the book by John Bryson called Strategic Planning for Public and Nonprofit Organizations. And I'm citing the 4th edition. I don't know what edition that book is on. I think it's the 5th or 6th right now. At any rate, John Bryson is from the University of Minnesota and noted as one of the leading experts on strategic planning for public and nonprofit organizations. So what I want to do is I want to go through Bryson's process of creating a strategic plan, and I want to make linkages to chapter 2 of the Pines text. So that's what the rest of this lecture is going to do. And again, it supplements, not replaces the reading. So at the outset, what Bryson says about strategic planning is that he gives this chart called the ABCs of strategic planning, which I really like because it's simplistic. It's not 10 steps. It's actually 3 things to remember. That is that any strategic planning starts with the knowledge of where you are at as an organization. And then it moves through your vision, mission, and goals to where you want to be. And that's what an understanding of your vision, mission, and goals gets you to, an understanding of where you want to be. And then finally, you develop a plan which tells you how to get there. And that is your strategic plan. So let me kind of go back on that and make a couple of preliminary linkages. So where you are, that means you have an understanding of your mission and the mandates. You have an understanding of your internal structure and systems. You have an understanding of how you communicate. You have an understanding of your programs, your services. You have an understanding of your people and skills. That's an HR linkage. You have an understanding of your budget, and you have an understanding of the support structure in place. Okay, so you move from there to where you want to be, and that means that you have an understanding of what you think your mission and mandates should be in the future, what you think the structure and systems should be, what you think your communication plan should be, what you think your personnel mix should look like, that is the people and their skills, what you think your budget should look like, and what you think your support should look like. So how do you get there? You write a strategic plan that says, this is what our IT and HR plan should look like. This is what our communication should look like. This is what our hiring and training should look like. There's another HR linkage. This is what we have to do to re-engineer and restructure, and this is what we need to do to recreate our budget in order to get there. And a strategic plan always carries with it some definite goals and timelines in order to do that. So what Bryson is really saying with this simple diagram is that organizations are supposed to think strategically, act strategically, and then plan strategically, which means that a strategic plan, and Bryson emphasizes this a lot, a strategic plan is not just some document that you put on the shelf, and then just refer to it every once in a while. It's actually supposed to be a way of thinking. So what I'm doing in this lecture, I'll get to in the next slide, is using Bryson's plan and making this linkage. Okay, so let me start here. I take every one of Bryson's 10 steps, and so by the way, even Bryson himself would tell you that you don't have to, when you do strategic planning, you don't necessarily have to take the 10-step model in that sequential order. There are things you can pull out of it that are important, and there may be things that aren't quite as important for your organization, but I'm going to follow the 10-step model only because I want to make these linkages with the text. So step 1 is initiating and agreeing on a strategic planning process. So this step really means that you want to create a formal strategic plan, which is a good exercise. Again, not to gather dust, but really to wrap your thinking around how you should run your organization. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, you have to address the purpose of the process. You have to understand what outcomes you desire. You have to understand who's actually doing the planning. So that is the roles, the functions, and the membership of the planning group. And then you have to actually understand your stakeholders. That would be internal stakeholders and external stakeholders, and their interests and actually their relative power in the organization. And so one of the steps that Bryson suggests that organizations do initially is a stakeholder analysis, where you actually sit down and have to list who your stakeholders are and what interests they bring to the table. Well, so what's the linkage to the second chapter here in Pines? I would suggest that the linkage is that on page 39 and 40, there's these 18 attributes that Pines suggests that senior leaders in strategic human resources management should have in an organization. So the question you have to ask is, okay, does the leadership of my strategic human resources management function actually have these attributes? Now there's 18 attributes there, right? So if you look at them, you're going to say, gosh, I don't know too many human beings that have all those attributes. So those 18 attributes are probably aspirational. But if you look at them, what you see is probably attributes that you would desire for a strategic leader in an organization. So for example, if you were going to hire an executive director of a medium-sized nonprofit, that might be a list of attributes that you'd start to look for in that person. Well, what Pines is saying is that a leader of human resources should be possessing those attributes, at least aspirationally. Okay, so what's the point that's being made? The point that's being made is, if we think of HR as a strategic function, then we're striving to find leaders with those attributes. If we think of HR, though, as kind of a compliance-oriented advisor function, then is there really a need for a leader in the HR organization to have those attributes? That's a question for consideration. Let me move on to the next one. Okay, so the second thing in strategic planning, which I have a lot of fun with when teaching the class, is identifying organizational mandates. Organizational mandates really are just the things that any organization must do. Why must they do them? Well, if it's a government organization or even a lot of nonprofits, there could be some formal mandates embedded in legislation, embedded in policies from above, embedded in ordinances or contracts. So these are obligations of the organization, their mandates, they're things the organization must do. But there's also informal mandates, right? So often those are expectations of stakeholders and clients, and depending on who the stakeholder is, those informal mandates might be quite strong. One interesting point that Bryson makes is that in many organizations, a large share of the members of the organization, that would be employees or volunteers, really don't even know what all the mandates are, or even some of the mandates. Well, that's actually reasonable because many people, their focus is on, I want to go to work today and accomplish my tasks. I'm not thinking about the mandates, the things that the whole organization has to do. I'm thinking about what I have to do today so I can get done. So it's kind of reasonable, but it's also not something that is desirable, because you really want people in the organization to understand the larger picture of mandates and what an organization must do. So where's the linkage with Chapter 2? The linkage that I say exists with Chapter 2 is kind of what I referred to before. If human resource management is strategic, if strategic human resources management is truly strategic, then the leadership of that organization is going to understand these mandates. If, again, it is simply the compliance function, go see the HR person because you filled out your insurance form wrong, there might not be an understanding of mandates. So to get from, compliance to strategic, we have to have leadership in that function that understands mandates. So step 3, clarifying organizational mission and values. Okay, a lot of people spend countless hours and days and weeks in developing mission statements and values of an organization. And this is the part of strategic planning that frustrates a lot of people. My own opinion is it doesn't have to be that complicated. The point is that organizations are a means to an end. Organizations have a mission. Public organizations have a mission. Nonprofit organizations have a mission. The organization is never an end unto itself. Many organizations act like they are an end unto themselves, and in some ways they're allowed to act that way, but they shouldn't be. What is the reason for the existence of this organization? And for whom is the mission accomplished? That is something that leaders in organizations have to keep in mind. So the definition of missions should not be complicated, but I would contend it's complicated for the very reason that people look at the organization as a bundle of tasks that have to be done, instead of as an organization that is formed to accomplish specific missions. So you have to start with the mission focus and then move on to the tasks. Okay, so again, I'm making this same linkage really, which is a more compliance-based kind of HR function is going to see tasks. A more strategic HR function is going to see mission, and how the tasks of HR begin to support the mission. I don't write it there, but that even leads to the idea that's discussed in Chapter 2, which is outsourcing part of HR. So actually, many organizations do outsource some of their HR functions. Why? Because they might not have the capacity to do that. So is that a good idea or a bad idea? Well, I would answer that question by saying, okay, is it a good idea in terms of the missions that have to be accomplished versus is it a good idea in terms of the tasks that have to be accomplished? If it's a good idea in terms of the mission that has to be accomplished, then it's worth considering. But again, the leadership in that function has to understand the differentiation between mission and tasks. Okay, step 4 in Bryson's process is assessing the organization's external and internal environment. So I think you've probably all done this. because one of the classic ways that people assess the environment is through a SWOT or SWOT analysis, right? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats or challenges. That is actually one of the most useful ways to examine your internal and your external environment. So understanding that the external environment really does present opportunities and threats or challenges, and understanding that the internal environment presents strengths and weaknesses. Okay, so this is where actually a very competent HR function should greatly aid the strategic planning function. But an incompetent HR function is going to detract from strategic planning. So let me tell you what I'm talking about. If in your organization you identify certain opportunities that exist in the external environment, opportunities to expand your mission in different directions, well, the question you really ought to be asking at that point vis-a-vis your human resources management is, okay, are the right people available for us to hire or recruit in order to help us take advantage of those opportunities? Well, a competent HR function ought to understand and have the ability to study in more detail the external environment. I mean, does your HR function understand the labor market that exists locally or regionally? Does your HR function have networks with universities and other organizations that help them in the recruiting effort? Does the leadership understand the internal environment? I mean, does your HR function actually understand the composition of your internal workforce? What are the areas of expertise of that internal workforce? What are the areas where more training is needed, where less training is needed? In my opinion, this is the step where a very good HR function actually earns its pay. But going back to the point I keep beating down is, if your HR function is simply compliance, please fill out these forms, I would suspect they might not have the ability to do this. Okay, step 5, identifying strategic issues. Well, so in the strategic planning process, this is the step where you've done all this preliminary work. You've identified stakeholders and what their interests and power are. You've identified your mandates. Those are the things that you have to do, the must-dos. You've identified the aspects of the internal and external environment. It's at this point where you take all that knowledge and you sort of disaggregate it, and then you reaggregate it into a list of strategic issues. So the point is, if simplistically we have issues or problems in the organization, we could probably categorize those as strategic issues or operational issues. So operational issues are, you walk in the bathroom and you're out of paper towels. Well, that's an operational issue. It's not going to become a strategic issue unless you find that the lack of paper towels is kind of an indicator of a poor purchasing system within your organization, whereby you find it's not just paper towels you're also out of office supplies. You don't have the right computers. You don't have the ability to do the kind of graphic production that you really want to do. So maybe you have a strategic problem that revolves around the inability to actually purchase in economical ways the kinds of things you need. It's a small thing, but it keeps organizations running. That's another area where an HR function should be your point of expertise, right? So you're separating strategic issues from operational issues. So the linkage to me from chapter 2 is, again, does this function understand the strategic issues? Does the strategic human resources management function understand if, for example, there's a local shortage of critical skills that might become a strategic issue for the organizations, for the organization's work. So there's other linkages, right? This, in my mind, is where this discussion of outsourcing HR comes in. HR functions end up being outsourced, I would contest, in possibly a haphazard way, just like other functions of an organization get outsourced. And by that I mean they get outsourced because they save money. Let's outsource this to save money. Well, that focus on saving money is a short-term focus. Now, focusing on saving money in the long term is also strategic. But if you outsource things as a reaction to a short-term funding shortage, you might not be addressing it strategically. I think there's probably no problem with outsourcing maybe all of your HR, but you have to understand, like outsourcing anything else, why you're doing it. And the final linkage that I would make is your HR information system robust enough? There's this whole discussion on your HR information system in the chapter. I think this is a linkage. Why? Because I think actually information systems can be a strategic problem inside the organization if your information systems consist of, 100 different spreadsheets that somebody has to keep track of, instead of an integrated system that is doing some of the functionalities that are being discussed, depending on the size of your organization. Okay, step 6 is formulating strategies and plans to manage the issue. So in the strategic planning process, this is really just writing the plans, but writing the plans that have timelines attached to them, that have changes that have to be made. So, changes to organizational processes, changes to organizational budgets, and we should probably add in there changes to the organizational personnel profile. This is the step really where I think HR really has the ability to contribute again, because human resources are called human resources because they are a resource. So we should plan the strategic use of resources just like we plan the strategic use of budgets, of monetary resources, right? Not to say we should reduce people to resources, and think of them in those sort of dehumanizing terms, but we do have to consider what contribution humans make to the organization. So the linkage here to me is that, does your HR function actually have the capacity to carry out the strategic plan that you've agreed on? And if not, how can it get that capacity? Can it get that capacity through outsourcing, strategic outsourcing? Other questions you could ask. Okay, step 7 just talks about reviewing and adopting the strategy and plans. Really, what I call this step 7, is sort of mid-level to senior level buy-in of the plan. Short of, say, your executive director, this is the step at which your planning team really, as a unit, buys into the plan. So is your strategic human resources management leadership part of this buy-in process? That, I think, is a key linkage here. So step 8 is establishing the organizational vision statement. Okay, so let me just say here, I think vision statements are greatly misunderstood, right? The idea of creating a vision statement for an organization is not to come up with something cute. It is to come up with something useful. And this is where I think a lot of organizations fall down. They spend weeks, they maybe hire consultants to come up with some kind of gizmo-y vision statement, when really it's exactly what the leadership wants to promote. This is the vision of the organization. Okay, so what's the linkage here? Here's the linkage. The linkage is that everyone on leadership in an organization has to buy into the vision and has to promote it and advocate it. So without that kind of leadership, without the leadership that does that, is your strategic human resources function really strategic again? Or is it just technical advisor? I think that's a really important question. Step 9 is developing the effective implementation process. This is actually when you come up with measures. This is how we're going to measure performance of this plan. Well, you don't just do that with a strategic plan. You do that really with organizational performance overall. This is an area, the linkage here to me in chapter 2 is the discussion where Pines talks about HR information systems. So HR information systems have evolved a lot, as you know. We've gone from having sort of a manila personnel folder on each employee, if you will, to a system that actually is interactive and enables the organization to include training, recruiting, payroll, benefits, discipline, all kinds of things in the same system. And the question is, does whatever system you use actually support the growth of measurements to actually measure how well your strategic plan is doing? So finally, the reassessing the process. This goes back to whether a strategic human resources system is really strategic. That is, does the senior leader possess those 18 attributes, or is that person aspiring to gain those 18 attributes? Bottom line, is your strategic human resources management leader a strategic leader or a technical advisor? So go back to this 5-step model. And so now we can ask, is the question, do you have a strategic human resources management system that is able to help you think strategically, act strategically, and plan strategically, as Bryson would ask us to do? Or is your human resources management function a compliance-oriented advice function? Some organizations might need just the compliance-oriented function, by the way. But if that's what we need, we can't call it a strategic system, and we have to rely on other expertise to help us think strategically. And so, again, I think this is the linkage that I would make to this chapter. You might make a different linkage, and that's fine. And so that leads me to this discussion question, which is, assume you're the HRM director for an agency that you happen to be familiar with. I'd like you to discuss how the strategy of the organization flows into the HR process. Or actually, alternatively, does it flow into the HR process? So all to say, is HR connected or disconnected from the organization's strategy, and why might that be the case? So thanks for listening, and I look forward to your discussions.